Hey, everybody. We're going to continue our discussion of scenarios involving market failure, right? So we've discussed externalities and public goods. So we're in chapter 13 of the Openstax Intro Economics textbook, and we're going to take a quick look at, again, other scenarios where when the market arrives at its equilibrium, it may not be the socially optimal level of production and consumption. So, looking at common resources and club goods. And the general scenario here is thinking about those characteristics of a public good, right? Where by its very nature, a good or service is non rival and non excludable. So, one more consumer doesn't reduce the ability of other consumers to utilize the product or gain benefits from the product. And non excludability, once the product is produced and made available, we can't prevent other consumers from enjoying it, essentially. And that, of course, led to the free rider problem and the inability of private markets, right, to produce the product. There's no profit incentive if they can't extract payment. So we're thinking about those characteristics, rivalry and excludability, with a public good, again, non-rival, non-excludable, with a private good, rival and excludable. Well, what happens on the kind of the off diagonal of that combination where we have one of those characteristics but not the other? So a good or service that is rival but non-excludable, or excludable but non-rival. So we can construct a little table of those characteristics. And again, we've already taken a look at kind of your standard good or service where, in the absence of externalities, private markets do provide that socially optimal level of output, both excludable and rival goods. And we've also taken a look at public goods, non-excludable, non-rival. We saw how that leads to a private market failure and the need for government provision of those products. So these off-diagonal elements will present kind of a different set of challenges and possible solutions. So what we'll call a common resource, a good or service that is non-excludable but is rival in consumption. And then on the bottom left, a club good, or what we'll call a natural monopoly, is excludable, so you can extract payment, but non-rival, so we can have simultaneous consumption. So starting in the upper right-hand quadrant there, looking at the characteristics of a common resource and how that leads to overconsumption, which we can see pretty quickly, right? So again, a good that is both rival and non-excludable is a recipe for disaster in a sense. So this is a product that is out there, it's available, anybody can consume it, but one additional consumer does deplete the product, right? It reduces the amount available for other consumers. We can't have uh, simultaneous, unimpeded consumption. So again, we don't have to be too imaginative to think of how this is going to lead to a problem, right? So each consumer receives the benefit of consumption, and because of that rivalry, reduces the availability to others. And since we don't have excludability, we'll have overconsumption as a result. So this is the classic scenario of the tragedy of the commons, right? Freely available common public resources are going to be depleted, right? It's the classic situation, right? When you're working in office and they say, oh, free donuts in the break room, they're gone immediately, right? One donut is consumed, it's not there for anybody else, it's rival, and they're free for anybody to have, so they are non-excludable. And when we think about environmental degradation, right, the reduction of resources available to everybody, they generally fall under this common resource category. So thinking about clean water, clean air, wildlife going extinct, fish in the ocean. Those are all common resources, rival but non-excludable and overconsumed and depleted. So this is once again a place where government intervention can have a positive effect, right? Can lead us towards that socially optimal level of output as opposed to causing a dead weight loss and pushing us away. Right? So we need property rights, we need legislation, conservation to prevent that overconsumption. So things like hunting limits, catch limits when fishing, uh, even having to get a permit to go into a national park and go camping. It restricts consumption. And harkening back to our previous discussion of the Coase theorem as a solution to externalities, another way to think about the role of government here is largely to establish property rights. And this sounds like the setup to a bad joke, but thinking about cows and elephants, right? You're in the countryside, you see cows all over the place, but elephants are definitely an endangered species, right? And you think, well, gosh, you would think it would be the other way around because cows are delicious, right? There's like huge demand for beef products. Elephants, not so much. There's obviously demand for various products that come from elephants, but as far as the per capita uh, demand for output coming from cows versus elephants, it's definitely more for cows. So why are cows plentiful and elephants endangered? Because cows are private property, right? So the owner of the cows has an incentive to prevent overconsumption, whereas elephants being more of a common resource, a wild animal, no one individual has the incentive to prevent overconsumption. So a silly, at least a silly sounding solution would be, well, let's just assign property rights. Let's just find somebody and say, you now own all the elephants. Well, now that one person's going to have all the incentive in the world to prevent overconsumption. So wildlife, again, regardless of the actual demand for their products, are going to be subject to uh, depletion, right, and extinction because of that lack of property rights. Now, looking quickly at the remaining quadrant of that little 2x2 table, what we called club goods or natural monopolies. And we saw in that lower left, we're thinking about goods and services that are excludable, but non-rival. So what would a product look like that has these characteristics? So we're thinking about excludability, right? So a private firm can keep you from enjoying the product, right? So they can extract payment. So therefore, we're not going to be subject to that free rider problem that we saw with public goods or the overconsumption that came with the rival and non-excludable common resource. But the problem that's going to come up here is because we have this possibility of simultaneous consumption because of non-rivalry, we're going to tend to have overproduction or overcapacity of these products as additional consumers do not, at least up to a point, as we'll see, reduce the benefits of others. So we're thinking about scenarios like, say, a movie theater, right? So once the theater is established, we've got, 300 seats in a given theater to see a movie. As consumers come in, again, up to a point until you get up to capacity, we have that non-rivalry outcome. And it might be the case that only 10 people go to see the movie, but the capacity is still going to be there. Same thing with, sporting events, things like, say, garbage collection, electricity, natural gas provision, cable TV provision, phone services in an urban environment. Same situation, right? Imagine, if you're a homeowner in San Francisco, you pay a fee to have a truck come and pick up your garbage once a week. In what way is that non-rival? Well, if one more consumer signs up for the service, right, the truck is already out there. It doesn't affect anybody else's ability to receive that service. Same thing. You move into a house, or say you build a new house in an area and you need electricity provided, the provider, the utility will just tap into the existing lines, doesn't affect anybody else, but they can definitely not do that if you don't pay. So how does this lead to a quote unquote monopoly situation? Well, the previous iteration, when we talked about monopolies, right, it was definitely with a negative connotation. When a single firm dominates a market, they will have the incentive and ability to restrict output and raise prices, generating that deadweight loss, monopoly rent, and a non-socially optimal outcome. But in the case of these club goods, non-rival but excludable, a single provider will actually be more efficient. So again, think about garbage collection. Do we really want 10 different firms with their trucks roving around the neighborhood competing for, the service of picking up our garbage, or does it make more sense to just have one truck hit everybody's house? Do we really want 10 firms putting up electrical provision capacity, right? All the wires in our neighborhood, or do we just want one that everybody can tap into? As far as a resource utilization, it's a lot more efficient to have a single firm do that provision. So what tends to happen is that we have a well-regulated monopoly provide these types of goods. In any given city, they have a contract with one firm that picks up your garbage. There's Pacific Gas and Electric that provides electricity in one area, and no other firms are competing. The trick is that it has to be a well-regulated monopoly, right? And that's what we call a natural monopoly, one that doesn't arise from anti-competitive practices or barriers to entry, but because of the nature of the product itself. So when you look at, again, utility providers, Pacific Gas and Electric here on the West Coast, there is legislation that prevents them from charging non-competitive prices, right? So the prices that they charge they're not equal to, but they're tied to the average total cost. So the level of profit is enough to keep them running, right? Enough to make it a worthwhile enterprise, but not an anti-competitive level. So the takeaways, again, know these two categories of goods and services, how they compare to private goods versus public goods. What is the nature of the market failure that comes from those characteristics? Overconsumption in the case of common resources, overcapacity and natural monopoly that comes from that club good scenario. So, hope that was helpful, and we will continue our discussion later. Thanks.